All right, so we're in John 8, and we're on page 49 of our textbook, Christianity Through the Centuries. And today we're going to continue on our idea on the Jesus upon which the church is built. And we're going to talk about 2 points today. We're going to talk about his historicity. Oh, isn't that a cute word? Historicity and his character. Historicity and character. So we're on page 49, and I want us to read section I and the historicity of Christ. And I want someone please to read that article beginning with Christianity has its beginnings. Who will read that? All right, Jordan.
Christianity has its beginnings from the subjective human side in temporal history. Because these values are inextricably linked with the person, life, and death of Christ, some consideration must be given to the evidence for the historical existence of Christ. Many have denied the fact that Christ was manifested in human history. It is fortunate that there is extra-biblical historical evidence for the existence of Christ.
All right, so let's talk about some of this extra-biblical historical evidence. Number one, Tacitus, the Roman historian. We see him spoken of. By the way, he lived in the 1st and 2nd centuries A.D. Tacitus, the Roman historian. He begins there in the very next paragraph. The dean of Roman historians linked the name and origin of Christians with Christos. It's really Christos. It's not, just to help you out here, not that this will make your life any better, but this would be Christos if you just say it like that. But this is the letter in, this is the letter in Greek. Christos. All right. So the idea here, and by the way, you notice that when people say, this is my favorite. All right, they go from Christmas to people are like, they took Christ out of Christmas. No, this is the Greek letter, which is the first Greek letter of the name Christ in Greek. Okay, so it's just shorthand Christmas. Okay, that's all it is. Okay, so don't freak out when people put Xmas up on their fence. They hate Jesus. No. They may not know it, but they're still saying Christmas. Okay, so just a little education. Because the first letter of in the Greek alphabet, rather in the word in Greek for Christ is that Greek letter chi, C-H-I, if you were to spell it, chi. All right, so anywho, in the reign of Tiberius, he suffered death by the sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate. Okay, so here's a Roman historian, didn't write any books of the Bible, and he says, without any question, that Jesus lived during the reign of Tiberius, and that he was put to death by Pontius Pilate, the procurator in Judea. That's pretty powerful, because there are people today who say they even wonder if Jesus existed. Well, here's a guy that had nothing to gain by saying that he did. Okay, a Roman historian. Next, Pliny, the Asia Minor governor. Pliny, who was the proprietor of Bithynia and Pontus and Asia Minor. Asia Minor today is what country? Does anyone know? Yeah, Turkey. So up in this horrible mess of a Mediterranean world I created yesterday on this board, you might remember over here, as a matter of fact, you can still see some of the unfortunate markings. Up here is this Turkey, right on the northeast part of the Mediterranean Sea. And so Pliny was in charge of Bithynia and Pontus. By the way, hold your place in John 8, please, and look in 1 Peter chapter 1. Hold your place in John 8, look at 1 Peter 1. I want you to see that these towns existed for sure. I need someone to read the very first verse of the book of 1 Peter. Heather?
Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the strangers scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia.
All right, so here's 5 regions named, and all of them are a part of what is known as Asia Minor in the New Testament era, today known as Turkey. So one of them is Bithynia. Pliny was the man in charge of Bithynia. And Pontus, which was another one named in 1 Peter 1:1, right? So here's a guy that reigned in the area that Peter and Paul took missionary trips through and started churches in. And he wrote to the emperor Trajan about 112 AD for advice on how he should deal with these Christians. And so he wrote an epistle, actually. Kind of strange. He wrote an epistle. Turn the page 50. Right below the picture of the Eucharistic feast depicted in the catacomb there. Pliny paid high tribute to the moral integrity of Christians by writing of their unwillingness to commit theft or adultery, to falsify their word, or to repudiate a trust given to them. He went on to say they sing a song to Christ as to a god. Think about that. Here's Pliny, a unsaved historian that wrote an epistle or a letter, all right? And he wrote it about 112 AD, about 20 years after the death of the last apostle. And he spoke of the Christians as people that you can trust, who worship a god besides the emperor. And it's this guy named Jesus. Think about that. That's powerful. So you have an unsaved man who says that these first and second generation Christians believed that Jesus was God. Isn't that something? They worship him. So when people say that Jesus wasn't seen as God by the church until the 300s, and they had a chance to kind of cook up that tradition and change what the Gospels originally said, Pliny says, nope, around 112, 114 AD, Christians were already worshiping Jesus as God. Isn't that something? Think about that. That's significant. Any questions about that? Okay. Let me see. When I got to Baghdad and we had taken over the Ba'ath Party headquarters, we asked if they knew of any Christians, because at the time none of those pictures were taken. And I said, do you guys know any of the... I said, what are all these houses? Well, these are where the Ba'ath Party used to stay. And really? And of course they had run off because we came into town and bruised everybody. And then I said, what is that over there? Well, that is where the treasury was. I said, really, the treasury? He said, yeah, really, actually, that's where all the Christians worked. Now, think this through. Saddam Hussein is a Sunni Muslim, or he was. And most of Iraq's ruling group was Sunni Muslim. If you don't know what that means, well, just know, first and foremost, it's Muslim. And they let the Christians work. He said, this is what this man told us. He said, it's well known Saddam Hussein had Christians working for him in his treasury because he could trust them. I think that's a lot like what Pliny said here. You can trust them. They won't steal from you. They won't try to steal your wife. They won't try to kick you out of your house. You can trust these people. And this is a man who is not saved. He's an unsaved man who said, if there's one part of the people in my jurisdiction that I don't have to worry about, it's followers of this guy named Jesus. Okay. Next. Lucian, the satirist. Satirist. What is a satirist? Anyone?
Political humor.
What'd you say? Yeah, he speaks satire. Does anyone know what that means? Okay, Edgar, I think, has a good idea. Political humor. So he's, in some cases, it shows up like plays, like allegory plays in the old Greek world, where they would, sometimes an actor would be a satirist. Well, anyway, notice what he said on page 50. Bottom of page 50. Another rather satirical and for that reason valuable witness is Lucian. He lived between 125 and 190 thereabouts. In about 170, he wrote a satire on Christians and their faith. Now, he was making fun of them, but listen to what he said. He described Christ as the one who was crucified in Palestine because he began a new cult. He wrote that Christ had taught Christians to believe that they were brothers and that they should always observe his law. So here again, an unsaved source, an unbiblical source, telling us that Christ lived and died. And how he died. Think about that. And where he died. Okay. And then lastly, for our heavy hitters, would be Josephus. Josephus. And you can find what they say on page 51 under Jewish testimony. He lived about 63 years old, maybe. this wealthy Jew who tried to justify Judaism to the cultured Romans by his writings, also mentioned Christ. Now, here's what happened with Josephus. Does anyone remember when Jerusalem fell in the first century? About what years? First century AD. About 70. It was, the siege really began, the Jewish wars began about 66, 67 AD. So, roughly 3.5 years of war occurred before Jerusalem finally fell under a particular Roman general by the name of Titus. Titus, a Roman general. So, there was a Jewish general. He was in charge of the Jewish army, and he agreed to surrender in exchange for his life. His name was Josephus. He was a leader in the Jewish army that was resisting Rome in the 60s AD. Okay, think through this. So he's an expert as a general. Most people are well read if they're running an army. He's well read on his people's history. And so he became the Roman historian for the Jewish people. He was on the Roman payroll, and he wrote things like Jewish Antiquities, many volumes. Jewish Wars, many volumes. And here's what he wrote. Josephus wrote of James, the brother of Jesus, the so-called Messiah. Remember Christ? Remember what that means? And another passage which is often condemned as an interpolation. What does that mean? To interpolate. What does that mean? Okay, so if you have 2 points, and you come along later and add one in the middle, it's called to interpolate. So you have this data point and that data point, and you add something in the middle because you think it fits. This, if I have 2 data points, and I think this should be added, this is called extrapolation. So when you have 2 points and you then decide that this belongs somewhere along with these 2 points, you are extrapolating. If you're putting a point between 2 known points, you're interpolating. So when Josephus might have thought that some data, when today's reader thinks that part of Josephus's work was a later interpolation, what are they saying? Yeah, that you read this that he said about Jesus, and you read this that he said about Jesus, so you added something in the middle that would sound like he said it. Okay? Be that as it may, you can't really prove it's an interpolation, so many still think it's an authentic part. And he wrote of Christ as a wise man condemned to die on a cross by Pilate. So 4 pretty staunch witnesses that at least say that Jesus died under Roman hands by crucifixion. And that he had followers that worshipped him as God and could be trusted. Okay. So lastly, for a couple minutes, let's talk about the character of Christ. The character. Basically, that he was without sin. Look at John chapter 8, and let's look, please, at verse number 46. He's talking to Pharisees, and he basically says in verse 42, if God were your father, you would love me. All right, now think through that on a world religion standpoint. By Jesus' definition, is God the Muslim's father? Why?
Because
how do we know that God is not the Muslim's father?
Ishmael
Based on this verse.
Because they don't love Jesus.
Because they don't love Jesus. So, either Muslims are outside of the favor of God or Jesus is wrong. But it cannot be both. Now, if Jesus is wrong, can you call him a good man? No. You have to call him a liar or at least a little bit weird. But you cannot call him. If I came in here today and started flipping tables and acted weird, you probably wouldn't leave here saying, what a good man. Okay? So if I'm loony, you're not going to say I'm a good teacher. If I'm a liar, you're not going to say I'm a good teacher. So one thing you cannot do walking out the door is saying Jesus was wrong in John 8:42, but he's still a good teacher. No. Either Jesus is right or Jesus is not a good teacher. And if he's right, that means you have to put faith in Christ and subsequently love him if God is to be your father. See how that works? That's a pretty full verse, isn't it? I proceeded forth and came from God, neither came I of myself, but he sent me. Why do you not understand my speech, even because you cannot hear my word? You are of your father the devil. He's talking to Pharisees who think that Abraham is their father and that God is their father. He says, no, the devil is your father. He was a murderer from the beginning and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks of his own, because he is a liar and the father of it. Now, look at verse 45. And because I tell you the truth, you believe me not. Which of you convinceth me of sin? And if I say the truth, why do you not believe me? So Jesus puts forth the same challenge to his listeners that we would put forth to the world. Give me one fault Jesus had. Give me one. Okay, you don't have one? Well, then why aren't you following a perfect man? It's simple, isn't it? You don't have to be a real sharp historian to ask someone that question. Can you give me one fault that Jesus had? Any sin? Not really. Okay, then why are you not following him? And that's a question we can ask of ourselves. It's a question we can ask other believers or other people who say they're believers. All right, so certainly we would have some testimony of people who could fault find with Christ, other than he started a cult. Okay. So look at page 52 of your textbook. Look at the top paragraph. Christ's sincerity stands out in the biblical records. He was the only human who had nothing to hide, and so he could be completely himself. He was never going to be afraid of being caught. So when you're trying to find fault with someone, Jesus is the wrong place to go. So tomorrow we'll finish the idea of the Christ, and we'll talk about his works. We'll talk about his historicity. All right, stop for just a minute. We have three pretty related words. We have historicity, historical, and historic. Historicity means that you can indeed find it in history. Historical is related to that. You can find it in history. What does historic mean? It's important. It's vital. It needs to be synchronized with the rest of history. Okay. Any questions about what we've talked about today?